and present, and also extend that respect to First Nations people joining us online today. As the national peak body for young people, we acknowledge First Nations young people as the future custodians of the land. AYAC remains committed to supporting the Uluru Statement from the Heart and to supporting the leadership and self-determination of First Nations young people. I'll invite you all to share where you're joining us today from. I also want to acknowledge that this session was made possible today thanks to the Australian chapter of the Professional Association of Lecturers in Youth and Community Work. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started, and I'm trying to keep it short so we can get in as much as we can today. I just want you to all be aware that the webinar is being recorded and closed captions are available if you want to use them. During the session, I encourage you to use the Q&A chat function you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can post as yourself or anonymously if you'd prefer. And if you see your comment reflected or want to prioritize it, you can simply like it to upvote in the questions. We're going to start with some prepared questions for Mike, and then open to the audience via Zoom's Q&A function for Mike to answer some questions from everyone. Additionally, we just encourage active participation through the chat box for any comments you have or any reflections. So our topic today is intersectional perspectives on youth poverty and economic disadvantage. We know that mental health has been identified as a top issue by young people, and we can't talk about mental health without also discussing poverty, disadvantage, and intersecting experiences. We're understanding poverty as a lack of material resources or income, and disadvantage as encompassing a broader social and economic disparities that hinder an individual's opportunities and well-being. In Australia alone, more than 1.2 million young people under the age of 24 are affected by poverty. Poverty creates numerous obstacles for young people, impeding their participation in education, compromising their physical and mental well-being, diminishing future opportunities, and heightening their likelihood of experiencing disadvantage as an adult. We also know these experiences can lead to a young person getting caught up in the justice system, which only amplifies challenges and perpetuates these cycles of inequality. I feel this discussion comes at a really appropriate time. On Tuesday night, we saw a federal budget released aimed at cost of living. It will have very little impact on addressing youth poverty in Australia. After the conclusion of our discussion with Mike, I will provide an overview of the budget, and I invite you all to stay on for that as well. But now I'd like to introduce Prof.Dr. Mike Seal. Mike has been involved in the multiple disadvantaged, homeless and youth and community work fields as a client, worker, manager, academic and researcher for over 30 years. We're grateful to be able to borrow an hour of your time, Mike, while you're visiting Australia, and to discuss these important issues and to reflect on some of your experiences and insights that you've learned. So welcome, Mike. I'll go straight into the first question. What unique challenges or opportunities have you experienced while engaging in youth work within compulsory contexts? So we're talking about educational institutions or youth justice systems.
I mean, in the UK, when we talk about youth work, one of the principles that is talked about a lot is the fact that it should be a sort of voluntary relationship, as in young people are choosing to engage with you. Now, historically, that probably comes from youth work that was done in, I don't know if you have this in Australia the same, but kind of, local youth clubs that young people would go to and engage with the workers and stuff. And I think it's a very important principle. But I'm not sure in modern day youth work if how possible that is, because often we're working with young people in kind of compulsory contexts where they have to work with us. And I suppose for me, it's going, how can we get some integrity out of that, and is it possible to do youth work which can engage with people and get young people to talk about their lives and what matters to them when you've got compulsory element to it? And so the two examples you've got, kind of education and criminal justice, two examples in case.
Mike, sometimes we have, and I know that I'm sure it's quite common around the country, but often people are termed youth workers when they're working in the youth justice system, and they might be working with young people, but they're not youth workers how we would call them, which adds another dilemma as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. One thing I've learned I've been here for about 10 days is that yes, there's quite a lot of differences, but often it's about context. But when you look underneath it, it's a similar dynamics and similar debates. So yeah, again in the UK, what titles people have can be youth support workers, youth development workers, youth officers. Sometimes youth isn't even in the title. You know, it's a real myriad of things and a myriad of experiences that people have. And yet, trying to find some unity between us is difficult because, and even if you have the title of youth workers, it's quite contested. You know, an old adage, a friend of mine, Mark Smith, if people know him, did a lot of writing about youth work. He said if you get 3 youth workers and put them in the room and ask them what youth work is, you'll get 4 opinions. You know, so there's a real contested version of what that means. But, and I think this goes, if I was to try and define youth, it's that we're probably different. And I think this is important within multiple disadvantage, because you'll have a lot of young people who are in the criminal justice system or have had a bad experience in the education system, might get put into alternative provision and all this kind of stuff. They're probably used to having workers in front of them and who will have had a myriad of titles and a myriad of I'm your worker for this and I'm your worker for that. And I think part of what youth workers is doing is to try and be the worker that that person might value, you know. And if I look back on the stuff when I've done it and when I was a client and when I was a worker, it was the person who went, they were actually useful. That felt different. That felt as though they were listening to me, you know. They were hearing me rather than going straight into, I can refer you to this service or that service, or, you know, it was about that relationship, you know. So in a funny way, I think that's one of the crucial things. So whether it's in homelessness, criminal justice, education, mental health, it's kind of going, how's that person going to see me? Are they going to see me as somebody who's useful and makes them feel better, or is it just another worker with a slightly different hat they're wearing?
And I going back to the question, I think when we go to those compulsory contexts and you talk about the relationships, and that's obviously a big challenge. What do you think the opportunities are of being that person? I mean, we're quite lucky in Australia. We do have a definition of youth work.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where you did get 4 opinions out of 3 people. It was exactly that process.
Yeah.
But
So
it can be really useful, but obviously not everyone, you know, still sings from this same songbook. But I guess you know, that building that relationship is really challenging in that environment where you're also they have to talk to you or they have to see you, and you know, as a youth worker you're in an environment as well which isn't probably of the way that you would choose to communicate with someone. Are there any opportunities that you see that come out of that as well, out of navigating that space?
Yeah, I think it's just, if you're in a compulsory environment, it's just harder. And you have to acknowledge that there's all kinds of different power differentials going on here, which can sometimes help that relationship, but often is not, might get in the way of it. I mean, I remember a colleague of mine who worked in a hostel where it was what we'd call a halfway house. Somebody coming out of jail, halfway house, they had to be there. Also trying to support them. So they had 3 different roles, and they were trying to manage a property. So there's all the dynamics of trying to do that and have the paid rent. How is that affecting other residents? They were also managing their rehabilitation, and they could get breached, and they had the power of them breaching. And they were also trying to be a supportive person who made a difference to that person. I think so there are opportunities, and he was a hat wearer. He would wear different hats according to what role he was in, and mid-interview would swap the hat he was wearing. So you might talk to young people about, where they're doing, and they'd talk about their drug use, and it was starting to get problematic, and he was finding it in the hostel because people come into his room, and suddenly he'd say, I need to put down the support hat from the housing management hat. And the young person wasn't daft. They knew what they were saying. They were saying, I'm trying to manage multiple roles here, but I still be someone human that can make a difference to you. And I think sometimes, if I look back on my practice, as a worker, I didn't always acknowledge the contradictions I was working to, and that young person would see the contradictions in my face and see me wrestling, but they would often internalize that something that I was disapproving of in them, or something was, I was seeing as problematic, when actually it was my own stuff going, oh, I'm not sure what happened with it. So I think there are opportunities, but they just take a lot more managing.
I think you raise an interesting point. I know sometimes there's discussion around the fact that young people in those situations, they've got so many workers, like you highlighted. There's so many people trying to help them, but there's overlap as well. So, you're having to give out the same information, you're having to go over the same story and trying to understand that, versus I think we often will say that it's better for them to have one person that can do multiple things. But of course, that also comes with challenges, and so I think it's that's it's an interesting way to go about it. And I guess it's a really good, clear signal about what role you're having, and
at what point,
maybe he was onto something. Onto the second question I've got here, Mike. I'm just thinking about just maybe we can drill down a little bit further. Oh, hang on. Yep, that's right. So when you navigate the intersectional nature of youth mental health, for example, poverty and disadvantage, when designing and implementing a youth work or justice prevention program, what are the, when you're navigating that, how do you balance up what to prioritize, the design, how you're going to implement it? Because they're all really complex issues, and they could take all your efforts and time in the one thing. So what do you do to kind of when you're designing and implementing, what are your considerations for that?
I think the temptation I had as a worker, and I think there's a goodness to this positivity, is that the instinct would be to leap straight to action, as in, what do I do? What program can I do? What will the content be, and all this kind of stuff. And that all does need to follow, but and maybe it's because I'm now an academic, but I think there is research to be done, so if you're talking about mental health, then the experience of mental health and how that intersects with things like gender, race, sexuality, really affects how that young person might perceive mental health and their own mental health. So actually, we've got a lot of homework to do, because I've seen programs that just make all kinds of assumptions. I mean, in the UK, certainly, quite a lot of we'd call it global majority, so it's population would have their experiences in the mental health system have not been good, and that has legacies for how their communities perceive mental health and their experiences of mental health. I'd love to say these things have changed and gone away, but you know what? Not always. So I think there's homework to be done to go, actually, we need to really research this. And part of that would be doing that research with young people, because even when most research has been done, often the neglected aspect of that is young people and their perceptions. How do they make of this? So that's why it's all kind of homework to do before. And the other thing I'd say is awareness of self. So it's actually looking at yourself and what impact that might have on working in that context, and your own suppositions and beliefs and things. So we're different ages, and I don't know your gender, but making an assumption we might have a gender difference here. and probably the experience, so me going in as a white older guy is quite different. And I'll have all kinds of perceptions, and I'll be received in certain ways depending on the community I work with. So I think the question of who I am going into that, and then who you get to work with the young people. So
that intersectional nature of things, I mean, we just highlighted a couple in terms of mental health, poverty, and disadvantage, but there's no two people that are coming with the exact same intersection or the exact same. So I mean, that's the, I guess we can make assumptions about how we would deal with that particular intersections, but then there's, as you've mentioned, there's so many different ways in which people present, which is probably why research to date has, maybe been a bit limited, because it's not possible to drill down into everything. But the general approach, I think, that you're saying is to be self-aware and to meet that person where they're at. It's a really interesting area.
The trouble with, intersectionality can get infinitely split, and there's almost thing. There's a lot of peer work that you have in youth work, which I think is to be lauded, but there's almost a crude version of it, which is, you'll get somebody who looks the same, or you think they're the same as somebody else to work with, and actually, it's not always that simple.
I think any label, I think when you try and either put a label on someone or in a category, which sometimes you might have somebody that wants to consult with young people, and we want a person that fits this particular, and which is not an uncommon thing. So I think it's a really fascinating area. As an example of all of these issues, can you talk through the interventions that you've found to be most effective in preventing youth homelessness, for example, and addressing the complex needs that young people present with, noting that no two people are going to be the same?
Okay. I mean, I can't, you'll have to kind of fill in the gaps for me in terms of the Australian context, and I'm sure people in the room will, but and I worked in the homeless field, and still do, for quite a long time. And probably the youth work view, of actually understanding yourself, putting the young person at the centre, not having deficit views of it, wasn't dominant. The way that young people were treated was not in a positive sense. What was also interesting is, and it goes back to the point I made earlier about jump into action, there was almost this view of homeless people, which was, let's keep practical. So let's get the housing sorted. Let's work out how people can put the gas on and electricity on and pay the bills and all this kind of stuff. So there was a real drive to a kind of practical solutions. The problem was, if you talk to a lot of young people, they would also have, if you talk to them in a crude way of going, what do you need? They'd often go, well, just get me a flat and it'll all be sorted. Now, on a human level, I can understand that reaction, because everybody wants quick solutions to make things go away. And also, if you've never had a home in a stable sense, and quite a lot of people I work with never had, they'd almost idealise this imagined version of it. Once I get this flat and I can close the door, I'll be fine.
The complex that sort of that occurs here. There's obviously housing and homelessness sector, and there are people that I guess advocate more strongly for the supports around it, and others that housing first model is something that goes on here as well. So I guess we're familiar with that.
Yes, and I suppose for me, I'm not saying housing isn't important, because that'd be a bit daft around homelessness. But
absolutely.
And but it's the stuff that surrounds it, maybe sometimes I'd even agree with housing first, that if you get somebody a house and then you build from there, that can be a good starting place. But the big thing for me, youth homelessness, and particularly that kind of multiple complex homelessness, is about multiple system failure. It's young people who have fallen through the cracks of multiple services, from education to care services to drugs and alcohol services to anything else you can name. And essentially exhausted the kind of community networks that maybe kept them going, and then they suddenly end up on the street. So it's going to be complex. And it's very easy to jump to simple solutions. And I suppose for me, if I've looked at what initiatives have actually made the difference, I was quite involved in the UK in just getting voice for homeless people, getting them to say, actually, these are my needs, and helping them to articulate that, and which previously had never existed at all. So, I was helped lots of self-help and advocacy groups amongst homeless people to talk, and to do things like research into their own experiences. Strangely, doing that was actually more powerful sometimes than what an individual key worker could do. An individual key worker could talk to them and say, yes, have you done this yet? And I can make this phone call for you, and etc. But it's highly individualized. But when you have people that come together and do something collectively, hear the voice, strangely, a lot of the other things in their lives, they suddenly became a whole lot better at. So they could advocate for themselves in their own context. They could actually make sense of the sort of chaos that was going on in their lives. I pause because I'm not keen on that word chaos, because who's defining chaos? For some people it's just, I know how to survive this. I'm actually quite good at chaos. It's actually stability that I've never had that I find quite difficult. But it's a very convoluted answer, but I'm kind of going, actually, I think what youth work does, which is empower young people, get a sense of themselves, get a sense of how they advocate for themselves within their lives, make sense of the myriad of the adult world that they have to try and navigate. In terms of homelessness, that's what has made the difference.
Mike, what do you think, what can services do better, like in terms of how can they better coordinate what they're offering so that young people don't fall through the cracks in the same way?
Part of me goes, they will fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
And I know that's not what you ask in a way. But I suppose it's what kind of agencies do.
Well, what can we do as youth workers? I think we can obviously be working with that young person and doing the best that we can within that context. But I guess we've got to note that the systems and structures around that as well, that the youth workers working in, what would improve it? What would...
Well, I think I'm all for networking and getting people to talk and getting people to come together. Now, some of that is about sharing information about young people. But you know what? Actually, I just think it's where people get to understand each other, because services, both between youth work and other services and with other youth projects, can demonize each other, can have a perception that I do the work that other young people and nobody else does. So in a funny way, I think actually getting past some of that, recognizing, having... Somebody once asked me the other day, going, what's the most important, characteristic of a youth worker? And often people will say things like passion and commitment to young people. And yes, I agree with all that. If I actually think one of the most important, it's actually humility. It's humility as a service to go, we work with lots of people, but we don't do everything. Other people might be doing it better. Other people might be doing it in a way that we can learn from. But when you're all desperately just fighting for resources, and often the structures and systems make you compete with each other. I mean, hey, I work in university. You want to talk about the competition? Universities are businesses, and they each other in competition. But we probably don't want to reinscribe that. We want to find a way to go, how do we come together and actually look at stuff? So the obvious version is to say, just get together and talk about good practice. But the deeper version is going, have some humility, recognize what you don't do, and have honesty about when it works and when it doesn't. That's not easy. How many pilot projects have said, well, actually we tried it and it didn't work. What they actually say is, of course it worked really well and give us more.
Yeah. That's very true. I think too, the nature of all the funding and the way these things are set up, they're usually asking too much of what's realistic. And I think a lot of people tend to overpitch, what's being offered, what's possible, what can be achieved, when actually it is always those longer term commitments that, it's the long game. But the systems that are there in terms of program funding, pilot funding, resourcing, it's not consistent, and and all of those things. So I think that's a big issue that you've highlighted. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Really, very occasionally they do go, oh, we're going to offer funding for a longer term based, but it's rare.
And it's really hard, and trying to stay principled within that.
Yeah.
A theme we were talking about yesterday about all the meetings I've had this week so far, and one of the big things we said is like, how do you be principled and yet pragmatic?
Yeah.
How do you make that work in a context where it's short-term funding, it doesn't look long-term, it doesn't measure things that you think are important,
and the limitation of what your position is resourced to do or funded to do, I think too, is a massive challenge. You can see that there's potential for a lot of other things. I mean, I think in any community sector, in any part of the industry, there's always so much that could be done, but it's limited by the resources and time. And yeah, it's a big one. I might move on to another question.
Yeah. Okay.
Mike, because I think that these are all really valuable points, and I think for an Australian audience, it's all very familiar. The same scenarios happening here. I'm just wondering about, in terms of priorities for action. I think we've touched on a few different points, but I'm just wondering, what do you think is the most pressing priority or area for action for policymakers, for youth workers and advocates working to address poverty and economic disadvantage? Are there things that you've seen that have worked really well? Or what are ideas? No pressure. It's a really easy, small question.
Yeah. It might not be the answer you want, but I'll start with it if that makes sense. I remember I went, and it's almost an attitudinal thing, and something I think we're really good at in youth work, but probably need to push more in how we negotiate. I went to a conference in Europe, and it was it was about 10 years ago when we had a whole lot of riots in the UK.
Yeah.
And young people were involved in a number of riots, and the press had put it in a certain way, which had been interpreted by government in a certain way. So we need to make examples of young people. So you had young people who were like getting sentenced for 4 or 5 years for stealing a water bottle and things like this. The judges were saying we need to make examples, even if that's what the law says. Now, and it was just really interesting because I was at this conference, and the opening question I got, so if you think that was a hard, they said, why does the UK government hate you? And I was like, and what they were saying is, look, I'm not saying we're perfect, but there seems to be a real deficit view of young people. Young people are, it's got worse. This generation is bad. This generation doesn't listen to the elders. All this, whatever that might be, there's a real perception that you'll get. And funnily, if you look at history, people have been saying that for, I think it's at least 2,500 years. They've had this perception every generation. But I think in the UK, that's particularly bad. So if I was to look at that principle pragmatism, it's, the one I'd really keep hold of is, do not allow yourself to reinscribe deficit views. It needs to be something that will say, and not that young people aren't involved in certain things, because of course they are, the same as everybody, but it's a deficit view of them, and we need to, because in terms of criminal justice, that only goes one way.
We're finding quite a lot at the moment. I mean, it's all the time. It's not just at the moment. But if you look at the flavor of the media, it goes in waves, of course. But there's the deficit base. Young people are criminals. Young people are doing X, Y, Z. It's all of that sort of thing. And then on the other hand, we've also at the same time ignoring the vast middle. We then are going to the young people that we can use as examples that, it may not be typical of young people, but they're really eloquent. So, there's always, I think, is that's the case. It's the deficit view but we want to hear from you, but only in this sort of boundary of what we want to hear from you for those other types. It's a complicated thing. I've got a couple of questions from the audience, Mike. I'm just wondering how should youth work respond to the tension between predominantly individualized deficit-based services and programs funded by the government? And how do we challenge and change the economic and social structures that cause poverty and intersectional disadvantage? So how do we respond to that tension between, individualized deficit-based services and programs and actually make a difference and actually address those root causes of poverty and disadvantage?
I'm laughing at it, not because I think it's a bad question. I just think if I do that nicely, then I'll probably be able to retire. And I suppose, that kind of individualized case management view of young people. I suppose a big thing is, can that be done with integrity? I think there's times when it can. You can do work with young people on an individual basis, to counter some of the perceptions and internalized views that they've had of people who systematically told them that they're useless and worthless. Yes, I think those things are possible. But when do you say no? I mean, in the UK, in Birmingham, I'm from an area called Birmingham, if people know there, and there's been for years programs that come out around gang violence, young people violence, knife crime, gun crime, all this kind of stuff. And the huge debate is who takes the money and doesn't, and how can you do that with integrity? When is that done? And all I'd say is that there aren't simple answers. The easy answer is to go, you don't take money. And the other easy answer is you just take the money and do what you think makes sense. And both of which I understand, but it's finding a way that has some integrity between it and then articulating it. Years ago, a writer called Everett had a thing called the culture of lying, and he talked about the problem of just taking that money and using it for whatever is that it's quite hard to then critique it. If you're taking it, so what do you do? As for that wider question about how do we tackle the root causes of poverty, I mean, that's hard. I'm not sure if the real root causes are ever going to be funded through programs, because they go deep. Go deep to how we actually structure society. And there's long-term issues. These things are not going to happen quickly, even though if you look at things like climate change, the time is ticking and we're running out of time. Whether people are actually going to do projects that really shift that dynamic and debate, that's hard. That's about social action, isn't it? That's about wider social action and how do we start doing work around this.
How do you think we can shift the views of young people, given, what you said before around how they've persisted for thousands of years? What can we do as youth workers, as sector, as advocates?
Well, I'm sorry that when I meant it probably wasn't the views of young people, it was the views of others of young people, isn't it? And
that's very true. No, that's a really Good point. It absolutely is. Yeah.
I mean, young people have perceptions of each other. You can idealise, young people in a way that doesn't. But I think it is about wider campaigning work. It is about things like engaging with the media. It is about doing projects that might shift community perceptions. I mean, certainly, for instance, in Birmingham, projects that around knife crime. Now, if you actually look at it, knife crime is going down, violent crime going down. And from what I've heard, it's pretty much the same here. That doesn't mean that there aren't incidents which are tragic.
It's a big topic at the moment here. It seems, and a lot of it, I mean, I'm sure the same amount is occurring, but it's just, it's topical. And so there's very much the appearance, or there's moral panic in the media about it. Yeah.
This is how we respond to moral panics. I mean, one of the best projects I did an intergenerational project that actually looked at, because they said, look, actually, knife crime is going down, but perceptions and fear of crime is going up, and it's being fueled by a whole bunch of things, from media to also government policies or government statements from politicians. So it'd be kind of going, how do we work with this? And again, if I was to make a plea for youth work, it's to see that you need to work with young people within context, and the context, the most immediate context, is their own community. So I think in the UK we call it youth and community work, deliberately, and it's about saying actually young people exist in communities, so you have to work with them both in tandem. So that knife crime project looked at intergenerational work, looking at perceptions of crime, and it was the most interesting is that it worked well, and actually perceptions and fear of crime went down, and there's a whole lot of interesting things happen between the generations about shifting those perceptions. And then they start to look at, well, what's actually going on here? And it's probably about poverty, because we're all poor, and a lot of this is a result of poverty. But that's probably when the funding got, because that's a deeper, difficult question. It's how do you really attack and work with poverty in this. But that's one thing I would say to a colleague out there is that actually it's quite how much structural change you can do is difficult, but always the most other important ingredient I think in any youth project is have a sense of hope, but not a naive hope we can change the world tomorrow, but a hope that goes, okay, if we look at history, it goes in waves and things can shift and you can make differences. It's not going to change everything by tomorrow, but there are some things that we can make have an impact. And one thing I like about young people is sometimes I look at people in multiple disadvantage, and from an outsider it'd be like, wow, your life is dark. What chances you really have are stark. But they'd see hope.
Yeah, that's something I learned. I know when I've done, say, evaluations of programs and things like that in the past, and sometimes you meet a person and you think, whoa, like I can't, the amount that's gone on and the amount of challenge, but then it's always incredible because they're still like, there are people that have hope and they have direction, and they, it's quite like, I don't want to say inspiring because it sounds a little bit like I'm just a fly on the wall and maybe dismissing it, but it's a message for sure. It's certainly a lesson. And people I think nobody wants to be seen as a deficit as well. So yeah, it's really interesting discussion. I feel like we're probably just getting started, but unfortunately we need to wrap up. Mike, I'd be really keen to that the example of the program you talked about, intergenerational, to hear more details about that, and perhaps if you can forward anything, we can share it with the audience as well, because it's always good to have different examples and ideas and learnings from other places.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Mike, for your insightful reflections and for sharing your experiences so generously. Your knowledge and passion have made it a really interesting session. And thanks for leaving us with a lot to contemplate around, meaningful youth work in Australia. And definitely we'd love to hear any other examples that we have. But I'm going to go on now to our budget update.
Okay.
So feel free to stay with us, Mike, if you'd like. But yeah, I want to get to that in light of the conversation around poverty.
Yeah. I might
to
leave.
share.
I've got to go to another meeting if that's okay.
Okay, all right.
Good to meet you all, and yeah, keep the fight going.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Take care, all. Bye.
Thank you. I just want to begin my budget summary and just by saying that it's really just a highlight of like key points. It's not intended to be a comprehensive analysis at this point. I'll do my best in the time that we have, but I want to encourage you to send through any questions you have about the budget, any opinion that you have, and especially any questions that you would like us to forward into the estimates process. I'm very keen to take anything that you might have that you want to share. We will share a document with you after this that will have more detail as well. So if there's something that's not covered, rest assured that we've chosen to just perhaps do our highlight reel. Well, I don't want to call it a highlight reel because it's not all good, but we've chosen to just do some key points. So the May budget was a promise to close the generational divide amidst a challenging time for young people who continue to be disproportionately impacted by cost of living pressures across various life domains, including mental health, employment, and housing. Whilst the budget introduced investments in critical areas, such as housing and homelessness, family violence, and education and training, it falls short of fully addressing the severe cost of living pressures faced by young Australians, particularly those on income support or who are unemployed. We support the government's efforts to reduce cost of living pressures, but emphasise the urgency for more robust measures. Increasing youth allowance and job seeker payments remains a critical priority to help young Australians rise above the poverty line and live secure, healthy, and dignified lives. In summary, despite being marketed as a better deal for young people, this budget has prioritised those already privileged and failed to deliver tangible relief for young Australians doing it tough today. The government's failure to increase youth allowance and the best rate of job seeker payments, it overlooks a vital step needed to lift young people out of poverty. So I'm going to go and just sort of go through particular, I guess, headlines and then a little bit about what we think that means. And I'm just really conscious of the time, so I'll try and go quickly. But just remember, please share anything that you have with us that you'd like us to note or anything else. So in terms of energy bill tax relief, all households, as I'm sure you're all aware already, are going to receive $300 rebate on electricity bills split into quarterly installments. What this means, one-off rebate is really the sole cash support for many young people on social security payments, and only those with housing will actually access the relief. So providing this support to everyone seems an inefficient use of funds to us. While it's going to help some, the relief demands means tested and a redirection to those most vulnerable. Onto the tax cuts. Average tax cuts of $1,900 were announced. What this means, the tax cuts include a big return for the wealthiest in our country. While the relief for young people will be variable, it will remain largely outweighed by the absence of increased income support and continuing cost of living pressures. In terms of income support, an increase of 10% from September to the Commonwealth Rent Assistance on top of the previous one. What this means is really, this is a modest increase amounting to an extra $9.40 per week for a single person. It pales in comparison to skyrocketing rental prices, and the increase is really unlikely to provide relief for most young people who are already deep in housing stress. In terms of job seeker, recipients able to work up to 14 hours a week are now eligible for the higher rate, which is an increase of $54.90 a fortnight. What this means, the changes will only benefit 0.06% of recipients, leaving 99.4% living below the poverty line. We also know that 18 to 24-year-olds make up 25.2% of the long-term unemployed, and financial difficulties are compounded by the disproportionate job insecurity among young people. What's missing? Despite the booster concessions, there is no increase to the youth allowance and standard job seeker payments, leaving young people living significantly below the poverty line. In terms of education and training, the help indexation rate cap will be capped and backdated to the 1st of June 2023. What it means, this short-term relief will support young people who have a higher education debt by reducing the amount owed, and it aims to reduce financial barriers to education and training moving forward. However, analysts have suggested fixing the maximum indexing rate would do a better job of preventing debt blowout. The Commonwealth Practice Payment from 1 July 25, students on clinical and professional placements will receive $319.50 a week. What it means, these payments aim to reduce placement poverty, but still fall far below the poverty line, equating to approximately $8 an hour while on placement. Students who manage to qualify for these placement supports also won't see any benefits for more than a year when they come into effect on the 1st of July 2025. University housing initiatives, there's new regulations which will require universities to build more student accommodation to alleviate housing stress. What it means, we think, this is an interesting approach to relieve housing stress for some of the almost 1.3 million university students in Australia, although it's unclear what the timelines for this initiative will be, and we also hold concerns about how this might limit opportunities for other young people. In terms of housing and homelessness, the crisis accommodation funding that I'm sure you've seen in terms of Home Time advocating for this, $1 billion has been redirected from the National Housing Infrastructure Facility toward crisis accommodation and transitional housing for youth and women and children leaving violence. What this means, this funding is a welcome first step toward unlocking 15,000 dedicated youth tenancies for homeless youth, one of the goals outlined in the National Home Time campaign. However, this budget notably lacks appropriate funding for frontline services to support these facilities, with nearly 40,000 children and young people aged 15 to 24 experiencing homelessness each year. These measures are just a first step. In terms of mental health, boost to various mental health services and initiatives, there was an allocation of $888 million to mental health packages over 8 years. What we think this means, these funding injections into key areas of mental health are welcome. However, a modest $42.5 million of the larger sum is specifically allocated to young people, with $12.8 million of that allocated towards the Indigenous Youth Connection to Culture program. Young people with trauma and mental ill health require support that is specifically tailored to them, measured to them. These measures won't address the overall demand for mental health services. And the Office for Youth, there's 1.7 million over 4 years from 23 to 24 to deliver initiatives announced in the government's youth engagement strategy, Engaged, which I'm sure you've all seen announced. What we think this means, it's a very small figure to attempt to deliver the many initiatives named up in the strategy, especially as just 1 year of funding has already gone by. It also remains unclear which, if any, initiatives have been resourced at this stage. In conclusion, the measures announced will offer very little respite from the continuing cost of living crisis that's disproportionately affecting young Australians. And I think also it notably lacks a vision in terms of, we know that things like an overarching strategy, we've talked about intersectionality today, so many issues cross over into other areas. And so that broader vision and direction that could be in the form of a report card or a strategy or something like that is also lacking. And that's something that we'll continue to ask for as well. I apologise for the hasty summary. As I said, we really encourage your feedback and questions or opinions about the budget. We'll share the document. Please send through any questions you might have for estimates. We're really keen to contribute actively to that process this year. But just noting the time, I'm going to finish up, and I again want to thank Dr. Mike Seal for joining us and sharing his experience with us. And thanks to the Australian chapter of the Professional Association of Lecturers in Youth and Community Work for your support. I also want to extend my gratitude to all of you that have joined us today and contributed to the conversation. Your engagement, participation are invaluable to AYAC's work now and into the future. We'll be inviting you to share your feedback and thoughts on today's discussions via a survey. If you're able to fill it out, that would be great. We'd really appreciate any input that you have, because we want to continue to deliver a variety of things for you, and we want to curate that to topics that are of interest to you. So please stay connected with AYAC through our socials and also our fortnightly newsletter. There should be a link in the chat somewhere there, if there's not already, of the main ways to stay connected with us and hear about upcoming roundtables and events. Also want to thank Kirsty and Katie on my team for helping to prepare the budget docs and for their support in making this happen today. Thank you again. I apologize for all of me speaking and trying to do it so quickly, but I do really appreciate the opportunity to share these things with you. And we look forward to welcoming you to AYAC sector events in the future. Thank you, everyone.